I mean, there is a degree of humour to it, I suppose, if you look hard enough. But that could have been acid.
Yeah, I think it can be both. I mean, Nigel Farage himself put up a video just an hour later, never one to miss an opportunity, laughing at it himself, but that doesn't stop it also potentially being very serious. I'm an elected London Assembly member. I regularly work near Sadiq Khan, who, along with Rishi Sunak, are both huge security threats. So I'm very aware of this danger of the public being close to politicians. Now, this is a problem because in politics we want our politicians to be closer to the public. So these are increasing problems that I don't necessarily have solutions to. I think part of the solution is for all of us as elected politicians to take responsibility for our language and our behaviour and dial down the rhetoric. That's not saying Nigel Farage was asking for it, but I think he's certainly played a part in ramping up the pressure.
Have you ever felt unsafe as a politician?
I haven't actually. I've been lucky like that.
Well, let's hope it stays that way. Munira,
what are you planning to do to me?
Munira, have you?
No, I haven't, thankfully. I'm pleased to say, and that's, as we know, very often not the case for female politicians and particularly ethnic minority politicians. But I'm very grateful that I haven't felt unsafe. Although, as with all MPs, I know I'm not an MP at the moment, but with all MPs, we have taken additional security precautions, particularly since the very tragic murder of Sir David Amos, and with tensions in Gaza and Israel since then, I've certainly stepped up some of my own security measures to ensure that I and my staff, more importantly, feel safe. But just on the Nigel Farage point, look, I disagree with pretty much every word that man says. I think probably the only thing we agree on is electoral reform, I think. I think it's incumbent on all of us, whatever our views, even when they are polarising and very objectionable, to debate each other respectfully and avoid these sorts of very aggressive behaviours and abusive approach. Because, as you say, Iain, I was going to say it was a waste of a good milkshake, but as you say, it could have been a glass of acid. And then what? So I don't think it's the right way to go. Actually, we need to tackle him head on and expose a lot of the lies and the deceit in many of his arguments.
A lot of text coming in on this saying, it was all a hoax, that the person who allegedly threw the milkshake is the partner of a Reform UK press officer, and it was all a publicity stunt, which, it's on Facebook, so it must be true.
Of course it is true.
Annabel.
Well, look, I mean, I think just because you don't agree with something a politician is saying, that doesn't mean that you harass or assault them. The woman who was responsible for this has been arrested, and with good reason. Of course, it's antisocial behaviour, as you
assault,
said.
Isn't it?
That's what she's been arrested for at this stage. It certainly looks that way. Look, Nigel Farage is a divisive figure in British politics. That isn't to say that he doesn't speak for, I suspect, a large silent minority in this country today, or often a silent minority. And it's really important, as you've said, Iain, that politicians are able to feel that they can go out and meet members of the public, they can go on walkabouts. Look, we have a long and not so proud history in Britain of egging. Nobody will be able to easily forget John Prescott punching a member of the public. And I think, we will all hope that this milkshake incident is the end of it, but fear that it won't be.
Anybody know who was the first politician to be egged in this country? I'm reliably informed by my colleague Connor that this is true. It seemed to me a bit late in the day. Harold Wilson, apparently. I would have thought it was almost a tradition decades before Harold Wilson, but apparently not. Polly Toynbee.
Well, I think the press has to be responsible about this. I'm a bit distressed that you were leading, I don't know if the BBC was leading as well, on this kind of non-story. It encourages show-offs to have a go at politicians. And I think there ought to be a kind of agreement to have an absolutely minimal sort of one-line nib in newspapers when something like this happens. They egged Ed Miliband, and it's a way of humiliating politicians.
I've been egged
as well. Yeah, well, it's a way of humiliating people in a way that's very undemocratic, quite nasty, as well as scary, because, as you said, it might well be acid. But I think that, maybe the press should get together with politicians and not encourage it.
But you see, that will just feed people who think that there is this sort of conspiracy between the
you
press
still
and
report
politicians.
it, but you don't put it at the top of the news as if it was some stupid person with a milkshake was a kind of major part of this election. The election's about, well, I wish it was more about very serious things. And I think it's demeaning to politics in general. Never mind who it is, even if it's somebody you detest.
Right, let's move on then. We'll take your advice. So I have to say, just briefly, on my experience of egging, I was on a stage with Cecil Parkinson and his wife, and all the eggs hit his wife and me. But I didn't even know I'd been egged, because if you throw an egg at somebody, obviously it shatters as soon as it hits them. And I just looked down, there's all this awful yellow stuff dripping down my new suit, which was ruined. And I'm still bitter, and this was 1985. Right, let's take a text question from James, who says, will we learn anything new from the TV debates, or will it just be a pointless personality contest? Annabel.
Well, I certainly hope that we'll learn something new. I hope that we'll learn something new about Labour's agenda for government, because it seems that the closer we get to the general election, the more vague their plans become. So much has been watered down or scrapped entirely in recent months. The New Deal for Workers, the £28 billion Green Prosperity Plan, and so on and so forth. And I think that voters, there are a lot of undecided voters out there, have certainly turned away from the Conservative Party. Many of them feel disillusioned with politics more broadly. Many will want a reason to get to the polling station, possibly to vote Labour, and they simply haven't been given one yet. Rishi Sunak, I imagine, will be hoping to draw Keir Starmer out into the open to show that actually Labour are unprepared for government, and it'll be a challenge for Keir Starmer to resist that. And of course, it's as has been said, it's less a debate than an opportunity for politicians to get their messages across. So I expect we will hear a lot about change, an end of Tory chaos from Keir Starmer, and a lot about probably change and stability from Rishi Sunak. But one hopes it might amount to more than that.
Munira. The short man's not involved.
No, he's not. So
He's also not doing the one on Friday when there are 7. Apparently Daisy Cooper is.
Oh, that's news to me. I
It
didn't
seems
know
a
that.
bit odd to me, but...
I wasn't aware of that, so that's news to me. But I'm not sure whether we will learn very much. I suspect you'll have Rishi Sunak trying to convince the country that he's got a plan, despite the fact that every public service that you can imagine is in free fall, and he doesn't really have a plan and is clearly just tacking to one, core vote strategy. Yes, I wish the Liberal Democrats were part of the debate, because when we do have the opportunity to put our case forward, I think the public are very keen to hear what we say about the health and care crisis. We've put forward a very ambitious policy today on free personal care, which will help alleviate pressures on the NHS and support many people who otherwise can't look after themselves and need help. We've put forward interesting policies on the environment, particularly tackling sewage in our rivers and seas, and on the cost of living crisis. And when people get this chance to hear that, they love it. And you can see that in many of our target seats where we're doing incredibly well, and we've seen that in recent local elections and parliamentary by-elections. So I hope when we get the chance to put our case forward, whoever that might be in the debates, then people will actually find that there are parties that are saying something interesting, particularly the Liberal Democrats.
OK, Polly?
I think it's going to be very hard indeed for Rishi Sunak, because almost any issue that any member of the public or anyone else turns to, it's like being egged, really. I mean, whether it's about, schools, the IFS today has a report saying, they've lost 9% of their funding, 26% of their capital. Whether the NHS, everybody feels passionately about that, cost of living, police, prisons, wherever you turn on almost every subject, sewage, as Munira said, he's very vulnerable. He hasn't got many safe places to be on the big issues of the day. I think that's a problem. But in the end, isn't it? These debates are really a sort of touchy-feely. Who's most agile? Who's most likeable?
Who's got the best one-liner?
Well, partly, but also who sounds serious and sensible, who you trust. If any of them, and people trust in politicians is very low at the moment. So, I think it's more about the feeling in the air at the end of it than specifics.
Do you think it's odd that this debate is only an hour long, with ad breaks, it's probably more like 50 minutes. I mean, this programme, I think, is sometimes too short. But if you think about it, it's going to be the same length as this. How are they going to cover all of the issues that need to be covered? It's ridiculous, isn't it? Surely it should have been at least an hour and a half, if not 2 hours.
Well, there's an awful lot of issues they don't want to cover, either of them. I mean, if you think of the big issues that are not really there, I mean, the climate is sort of there, but not really, when it should be the major thing in the election. Brexit, neither side.
No one's mentioning it.
No one wants to go there. But Tories, because it's been a disaster, and Labour, because they'll be pinned as being Ramonas. And, you know, social care, which blew up in both for Theresa May and for Labour in 2010. They don't dare go there because they'd have to start saying how they're going to pay for it. The 30 billion black hole that, you know, Jeremy Hunt has lobbed this debt over the fence after the next election when he won't be there. And neither side can say what cuts, what tax rises. There's an awful lot they don't want to talk about, so maybe an hour will be plenty.
Zack.
This debate should be an open goal for Keir Starmer, 14 years of Conservative government and failing public services. But yet we know this country is utterly uninspired by Keir Starmer. And in fact, on so many issues, they're utterly indistinguishable. So take Rwanda, for instance. This is one of the most inhumane policies I think you could dream up. But even more than inhumane, it's also unworkable. What did Keir Starmer say about it today? He said that Rishi Sunak is too liberal on immigration. Both of them are dancing to Nigel Farage's tune.
That wasn't a comment on the Rwanda scheme. Labour have promised to abolish the Rwanda scheme. There is a difference there.
Well, they're talking about immigration, and if you're going to say they're too liberal on immigration, then what was their solution to that? It was the Rwanda scheme. Ultimately, we need, and I saw you tweet out today, why are politicians not speaking up for migration? It always triggers me because the Green Party are always speaking up for migrants.
To be fair to myself, I did actually say that twice in the last hour when we were doing the phone-in on it. So,
Apologies,
and
for
indeed
correcting.
the SNP.
Also, the debate I think we should be having is a climate debate, and I'd love to see LBC and perhaps Iain Dale hosting a climate debate.
Oh my goodness, there's a thing.
It really feels like it's missing from this conversation. And you've got the Labour Party, who promises £28 billion. That wasn't enough in the first place. And then have backed down from that too. They're suggesting this Great British Energy Scheme, but actually it just looks like a PFI scheme in disguise. And ultimately, what we really need to put front and centre is the future of our planet.
We're going to take a break from Cross Question for a couple of minutes because we're going to talk to Victoria Atkins, the Conservative Party's Health Secretary. She's in Manchester. I think, Victoria, you are in Manchester, aren't you?
I am. Hello, Ian.
Hello.
Yeah. In sunny Salford. It's a beautiful evening. We're going to see a lot of democracy in action tonight.
Well, I hope so. I was talking to Shabana Mahmood for Labour earlier, previewing the debate. So let me ask you a couple of questions that I asked her. I mean, when you're watching this kind of debate, when your leaders sort of performing, are you sort of anxious? Are you nervous for them, or are you just sort of willing them on?
I have absolutely no nerves about the Prime Minister and his performance in this debate. I think he will show us all what a class act he is. He has the brains, he has the integrity, but he also has that energy to drive forward not just policies that we have put in place in the last 18 months or so, but his vision for the future. And I think we're really going to see a contrast tonight. I mean, I, for one, hope that his personality really comes out, such as we saw, if we remember back to those dark, dark days of the pandemic when he announced the furlough scheme and the small business grants and loans that saved millions of jobs and businesses across our country. And that sort of energy and that vision and that real willingness to put forward radical and exciting new ideas for our country, I think will come through tonight. In contrast, we have a Labour Party that seems to think that governing the country is equivalent to holding a vase whilst walking. I don't get it. Governing our country is a great deal more complicated.
There is a problem, isn't there? Because we all remember Rishi Sunak in that first leadership election debate with Liz Truss, where he spent 30 minutes really going for in quite an aggressive manner. Now, he could do that with Keir Starmer, but I wonder whether that would be a dangerous strategy and that whether it wouldn't be a better idea to play the statesman.
Well, it will be entirely for Rishi, and I've no doubt he will
What
get
would you
this
advise
absolutely right.
him?
But as I say, well, it's not for me to advise him. He's the
somebody
Prime Minister
needs
of
to.
the United Kingdom, and he, believe you me, that when one thinks of the gravity of the role and the enormous personal aptitude he has shown in very difficult times, during the pandemic, but also actually, if you think, grappling with the aftermath of the pandemic, and indeed as Health Secretary, it's been my privilege to put in place and deliver on the accident and emergency recovery plans that we have put in place. Our work to tackle some of the problems that have hung over from the pandemic, but also I want his personality to come out, because I think he's a great guy, and I think that sometimes the burden of office, the responsibility of office, his personality is hidden, if you like, by the responsibility of office. So I've no doubt that's going to come out today. But I also think that this should be a time when Sir Keir Starmer starts to answer questions about what his plans actually are. The reason that we keep saying he has no plan is because he has no plan, and that is not good enough for the Great British people
Julie
to make
Etchingham
that
will
decision
put those
on
questions
the 4th of July.
to him. Now, let's just finish off with the same question that I put to Shabana. I suggested that we might hear the word change quite a lot from Keir Starmer and the word plan quite a lot from Rishi Sunak. I reckon 43 changes and 27 plans. Any advance on that?
Well, I think we've got a hint as to how many times Sir Keir Starmer is going to use that vacuous word without any evidence or substance to back it up. From the donation that he has apparently received recently, some £2,500 to buy lots of pairs of glasses for him. And that rather reflects, I think, the numbers of visions and makeovers and new policies, policy relaunches that Sir Keir has had. Contrast that with the Conservative Party, where we can point to the fact that our children, after 14 years, our children have the highest, the best reading rates in the Western world. The fact that 800 jobs were created every day of our government, even during COVID. The fact that waiting lists in the NHS, it's been very tough going, but they are going down.
I suspect you could give us lots more facts along those lines, Victoria, but we have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Hope you all enjoy the debate, which starts at 9 o'clock. That's Victoria Atkins there, the Health Secretary and Conservative. No, I can't say Conservative MP because, as you said, Munira, none of you are MPs anymore. Conservative candidate. I don't even know where she's standing. We'll get your reaction to what we just heard there in just a moment. It's 22 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
Here
With Iain Dale on LBC.
We have with us in the studio Zack, Polanski, Deputy Leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, Munira Wilson from the Liberal Democrats, Polly Toynbee, columnist for The Guardian, and Annabel Denham, Deputy Comment Editor at the Daily Telegraph. So Victoria Atkins there, characteristically ebullient, very sort of positive it seemed, Polly, putting on an act.
Yes, of course. Anybody who wasn't terrified for their leader at this stage simply doesn't get it. These debates, in a way, are not important, as we discussed before, because they don't talk about things you want them to talk about. But on the other hand, one slip and you can be done for. If anybody ever thought for a moment they wanted to be Prime Minister, this is the moment where you take a deep breath and think, no, I don't think so.
Munira, you'd love to be in one of these debates, wouldn't you?
I don't know about that, but Victoria was putting a brave face on it. We she tried to convince you that NHS waiting lists are doing all right when they're sort of at record highs, and they were going up even before the pandemic hit. It's quite something to behold. And I know they bang on about furlough, but I remember you and I, Iain, during COVID, having a long discussion about how actually 3 million self-employed and small business owners were totally overlooked and excluded, and many of us cross-party campaigned long and hard on that, and those people were let down. They haven't forgotten. I still have people coming up to me on the train and in the street saying thank you for fighting for us. So yes, there was support for people, but it was inadequate, and we've had the crashing of the economy under Liz Truss. We've got,
I suspect Keir Starmer, that will be one of his catchphrases as well, just the words Liz Truss.
Yeah, I'm sure that will
Annabel
feature a lot.
Well, the Liz Truss question's interesting, isn't it? Because we'll see tonight how much Rishi Sunak is willing to look back on the Conservatives' 14 years in government, and specifically the Boris Johnson and Liz Truss eras, and how much he will want to encourage the public to look forward to what 5 more years of Conservative governments might look like. Look, I think that these debates are significant in a way because voters are so fatigued by the whole process already. We're barely 2 weeks in, and not even 2 weeks in. And I think that people will sit up and will take notice to the two main candidates. People understand that this is a 2-horse race, even if one of those horses looks like a 3-legged pony at the moment. People feel as though there's only a cigarette paper between the two leaders. And so, I think that this could be an important moment for Rishi Sunak, not because he's going to significantly turn the tide. Indeed, the polls have remained stubbornly consistent over the last couple of weeks, but because it perhaps will have some bearing on the scale of the Conservative losses, and therefore could be quite significant for the shape of the Conservative Party after the general election in terms of who's going to lead it, who's going to hold on to their seats, which MPs will still be in place. Will they take more of a hammering in the red wall than they will in the blue wall? There are all these important questions, and while the debates may seem trivial and like a personality test between the two leaders, actually they could be perhaps a bit more significant than
Zack.
many people think.
I think what people really need is hope, and not just hope, but a plan of action as well. Real hope and real change.
A hopey, changey thing.
Well, no, but
Sarah
what I was going to say is hope and change are really important, but so is investment. Otherwise, that hope and change is meaningless. And I think when you've got both parties essentially pushing austerity 2.0, in fact, you've got the Labour Party saying there's no money left, we have to stick to our own fiscal rules. But actually, if they just pledged for a tax on the super rich, I'm talking about multimillionaires and billionaires, assets of 1% on assets of £10 million or more, you could be raising about 40 to 50 billion pounds a year. You could be putting straight back into our public services. That's real hope and real change, and that's what the Green Party are offering. And when you look at the two old parties, it just seems more of the same. And more of the same, you can hear from this conversation, has led us to a country that feels broken. People are tired, and we need that hope and change.
Zack, I'm sorry, I'm just going to come back on the wealth tax point there, because if you look at all of the other countries throughout history who have tried to introduce some kind of asset tax, almost all of them have rowed back from it because the administrative costs have outweighed the amount of money that is brought in. And they end up costing the exchequer much, much more than they're able to raise. And I think everybody sat here today would like to see the super rich, the billionaires, perhaps paying more in tax. But unfortunately, there simply isn't a mechanism through which you can do that, at least in redistribute in a way that people would like to see and would view as more fair. So I think that is just a complete red herring. OK,
Matt in Hassocks has got a really good question here. He says, I'd like to ask the panel which question they think the leaders are most hoping that they won't be asked.
Oh, good grief.
Can I respond to that with why won't you implement a wealth tax?
Well,
I can answer it in 60 seconds.
You can't, because we've only
30
got
seconds.
about 60 seconds before we go to the news bulletin. So let's just stick on Matt's
20
question.
seconds. Let's redistribute wealth.
Okay,
We already are.
Polly, what do you think Keir
Not enough,
Starmer
clearly.
would least like to be asked?
I think it's very difficult for him to say how they're going to pay for all the things that they want to do and will do. And we know perfectly well, ask the IFS or the Resolution Foundation, money is always raised after elections, whoever's in power, Tory or Labour.
And they'll take
but
things
they're
off.
not going to say
No,
beforehand.
and what they'll do is do what Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did and take things off the balance sheet. That PFI started that way because they knew that they couldn't take it out of normal public expenditure, so they took it off balance sheet.
There are lots of ways of raising. Rachel Reeves has lots of ways of raising money, particularly tax reliefs. Yes, raising it from the rich, but in all sorts of ways. The tax reliefs in this country are grotesque. Margaret Hodge gave a wonderful speech in the Commons. 100 billion. She, from her work in the Public Accounts Committee, said there is 100 billion there that could be pulled back from all sorts of tax loopholes, offshore, and all of that. Lots of things that actually Rishi Sunak has spent his life in finance, promoting. So
Okay.
I think that there is money there,
All right.
but they won't want to talk about it now.
Annabel, what do you think Rishi Sunak would least like to be asked?
I suspect that both leaders will feel on uncomfortable territory if they're asked about the spending side of the ledger. How are you going to cut government spending? Because both leaders have conceded that they cannot borrow more, that the debt is ballooning, that they cannot tax more. So where is the money going to come from to even maintain government spending at its current levels? There has to be a serious conversation in this country about the waste, about the fact that the government's tentacles are expanding into ever more areas of our economy and society, and how are they going to pull back from that? And I think that that's uncomfortable for both leaders. And Rishi Sunak, of course, has talked about once again about slashing the civil service headcount, and Keir Starmer has talked about tackling fraud. But ultimately, that simply isn't going to be enough.
Munira, what's the question a Liberal Democrat hates being asked?
Look, I think there's always going to be tricky policy issues for every leader, as we've explored here. I think actually in these debates, the ones that often trip leaders up are the personal questions, actually. And a lot of leaders don't want to be asked, what's your biggest failure, or, what was the last lie you told, or, remember Theresa May in 2017, or her naughtiest moment and fields of wheat. I mean, those are the ones where actually the public are quite interested in finding out a bit more about what makes their leaders tick. And I think both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer probably feel quite uncomfortable in that space.
Okay. Right, we will move on to more of your questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:32 news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
The policing minister, Chris Philp, has told LBC throwing a milkshake over Nigel Farage is not trivial and shouldn't be laughed off. A 25-year-old woman has been arrested on suspicion of assaulting the Reform UK leader this afternoon in Essex. LBC's been told it could take weeks to restore IT systems at some of London's biggest hospitals. A cyber attack is causing major disruption at hospitals, including King's College, Guy's and St Thomas's. And the Army says 3 injured military horses who bolted through central London during a training exercise in April have made a remarkable recovery. They're all back on duty and are expected to take part in the Trooping the Colour ceremony next week. LBC weather drying up in the south this evening, staying windy and wet in the north and a low of 5 degrees.
This is LBC.
When it comes
Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:35 on Cross Question. Annabel Denham from The Telegraph, Polly Toynbee from The Guardian, Liberal Democrat Munira Wilson, and the Deputy Leader of the Green Party, Zack Polanski. Let's go to a question from Sarah in Wimborne. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, Dale and panel. My question is, should NHS computer systems be outsourced? And if anything goes wrong, who should pick up the bill?
Now, a number of procedures were cancelled or redirected to other NHS providers today after a cyber attack struck major hospitals in London. Munira, I seem to remember you were a health spokesperson at one point.
I was, and I spent about 13 months working for an organisation that used to be called NHS Digital, which is now part of NHS England. And so I was aware of a lot of the discussions and the issues around computer systems and data collection in the NHS. Look, first of all, really concerning to hear about the cyber attack today, and I really feel for those patients who've had appointments and operations cancelled, and I hope that whatever the issue was, the weakness that the cyber attack was able to exploit, is being resolved quickly. I think the question from Sarah was, should these systems be outsourced? I don't think it's realistic to think that the NHS could create and run these computer systems in-house, and all the different electronic patient record systems that exist. What the issue is, I think, with a lot of the outsourced providers is a lot of the systems don't talk to each other. The jargon word for it is interoperability, and that's the ability of the different systems to talk to each other, be able to share data. And that is where you do actually day to day, aside from cyber attacks as we've seen today, that can put patient safety at risk, because if systems don't talk to each other, and if there isn't data sharing between primary care and secondary care, you can have a patient, and I've heard regularly from patients, I've experienced it myself as a mother of a child, taking them to A&E when we've been on a holiday in a different part of the country, and they cannot see the medical history of my daughter, and we're having to phone the hospital back in London to say, can you share this information, so they can see what antibiotics she's had in the last few weeks to try and get to the bottom of the issue that she's got. So we have a real problem with how we manage and oversee all of those systems in our NHS that we need to get a grip of, but I don't think the answer to that is bringing all of it in-house. It's just how we manage it better.
I mean, a cyber attack is a cyber attack.
Yeah.
It will attack public sector systems just as
Absolutely.
it will attack private sector systems. Zack?
I think you partly answered the question. A cyber attack is a cyber attack, so it doesn't look like that would have solved the case. I'll make a more general point, though, that I think outsourcing and privatisation are generally on the road to where things are failing. So, for instance, tomorrow I'm meeting a group of care-experienced young people. We've seen a situation where care-experienced young people are often treated as units of money as they go from foster care home to foster care home. That's an absolute failure of privatisation and outsourcing. We need an NHS that is free at the point of use. And when the Labour Party seems to be doing privatisation through the front door, I think it's really important that parties are out there speaking about the need for keeping things nationalised and keeping them free at the point of use. I do take the point.
Are you disagreeing with Munira?
I am disagreeing, but I take your point.
Even though she's worked in the system and clearly knows what she's talking about.
Well, we always need to listen to experts, and it doesn't mean that every expert won't disagree with another expert.
I'm not an expert on IT systems in the NHS, but I think...
And neither am I, so we need to listen to experts, right? But I also take your point that in this instance, that wouldn't have made any difference. You're absolutely right. But I think on the more general point, I think outsourcing becomes a profit motive, and we shouldn't have profit motive running what should be public services.
Annabel?
It will probably not surprise you to hear that I disagree with Zack's position on the NHS and the best way to fix what is quite clearly a broken system. I think one of the problems with the cyber attack today is that its effects have been amplified because people have already been waiting so long for appointments. They've already been waiting so long for operations, and if those are delayed further, then of course the impact is much worse. There, for about the last 4 decades, have been conspiracy theories over the NHS being privatised, that it's going to be sold off, usually by Conservative governments, for parts, and it will move towards some kind of survival of the fittest system where patients ultimately will suffer. And yet it remains as privatised today as it did about 3 or 4 decades ago. So, that simply hasn't been sort of borne out in the evidence. However, if you look at successful healthcare systems around the world, they are typically social insurance models. And I find it strange and frustrating that we refuse in this country to have a sensible, non-hysterical discussion about how we might conceivably move towards a situation like that. And importantly, those healthcare systems provide universal healthcare to everybody in the country. They just have a different model that allows more market forces, that allows more competition. And ultimately, and the data are clear on this, lead to much better health outcomes for patients. So unfortunately, we're not going to have that discussion this election. And we find ourselves in a slightly strange situation where it might be the Labour Party that brings about the root and branch reform of the NHS that is so desperately needed. But until such a time, it's the patients who are going to suffer.
Well, I've been trying to have that debate for 14 years on this programme, and whenever you do it, you're just accused of wanting to privatise it all. Exactly. And it's so soul-destroying. But it is interesting, Polly, isn't it, that Wes Streeting seems to be willing to think the unthinkable in a way that other Labour politicians in the past haven't.
I don't think he is at all. He says things that, are perfectly sensible. When you've got a very long waiting list, you will occasionally use private sector to do a whole string of cataracts to clear a waiting list. Tony Blair did that. It cleared the waiting list. You got waiting lists down to the lowest they'd ever been. They are now at the highest they've ever been. And when you talk about new systems, the new system you really need is money. It is the NHS has never been as underfunded.
£170 billion. What more do you want?
Well, that's just a number, isn't it? What matters? What I mean
it's
is
£170 billion of taxpayers' money.
Yeah.
It's now I think £1 in £5 that the government spends is spent on the NHS. I mean, how much?
What a pity
how much
you're
more
not
you
a
can
Tory
put?
candidate after all.
How much more? How much more could you possibly put in? Surely it's the system that needs reform.
Isn't it per capita that matters? We have a much older population. The older you get, the more you use the NHS. The per capita has gone down. Compare its social insurance systems. France, Germany, much better systems. It's not the system, it's the money. They spend vastly more than we do. And what's more, when you look at their social insurance systems, they're not that much difference. Most of it's paid by the state. It's a very bureaucratic way of paying it via, it might be an agricultural unit. I've looked at these in great detail, and it really doesn't make much difference, except it's more administratively
we've
complicated.
Slightly veered off Sarah's question about NHS computer systems.
No, I don't think
outsourced.
computers could possibly be done by the NHS any more than they should, build their own beds. I mean, computers.
That's a very good. I like that.
I think
or make their own medicines.
Yes,
I mean, it's
you've got
just
to buy
bonkers.
some things, and I think the complexity of computer systems. You have to have big expert companies from outside. The trouble is, of course, is that the NHS got left miles behind in the last decade and a half, and its computer systems are often out of date, as you were saying, Munira. Don't talk to each other. The lack of investment has been appalling, and the NHS has been told to use its capital funding for running its day-to-day business because it's been so short of funds, instructed by the Treasury, which is unheard of ever before.
And that will catch up with it in the end, won't it?
Indeed, it's catching up right now. Yep.
Right, I think we're going to go to an early break and then we'll take some more questions. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:43.
This is LBC.
Tailoring.
Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
Zack, Munira Wilson, Polly Toynbee and Annabel Denham here taking your calls. Let's go to a text question from Lucy, who says, why are all the main parties anti-immigration? Now, we were talking about this in the last hour, and I was challenging listeners to phone in and give me the benefits of immigration, because it's always the other way round, that people normally phone in and say, oh, it's all the immigrants' fault here and we can't cope with any more. We're full up. Well, we had some really interesting calls in that hour, but I find it really annoying is, I could say a much stronger word than that there's very few people in the Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat parties who will ever come on a programme and extol the virtues of immigration. It's all sort of saying, well, even Keir Starmer is now saying we need to cut immigration. Now, just to be fair to the Green Party, they do, and so does the SNP. Plaid Cymru, I have no idea what their policy on immigration is or what they've said. Let's start with you, Zack Polanski, on this. Why do you think the main parties just concentrate on the negatives? And of course, there are negatives. I mean, there are disbenefits from immigration too. I'm not pretending that it's just all one-way traffic here, but it does seem to be with certainly the two main parties.
Well, first of all, I don't think they're the main parties. I think they're the older parties.
Well, they
I think
are. They're the biggest parties. They're the only ones that are going to get into government.
Under a first-past-the-post system, which is broken and needs to go. But putting that aside, migration should not just be tolerated, it should be celebrated. And actually, UCL did a study that showed that migrants, no matter where their area of origin since 2000, have actually been of net benefit if we're looking economically. I don't like to talk about this just in money terms, though, because in terms of civic engagement, culture, food, and just simple humanity, we should be welcoming people who come to this country. Now, if you're asking me why parties don't do that, I think because the language of scapegoating and toxicity is a much easier story to tell. And when you've had 14 years of cutting public services, it's much easier to blame a migrant or a refugee or someone seeking asylum for the fact we don't have homes, or the transport is crowded, or you can't get an NHS GP appointment, when actually that is the fault of underinvestment and never the fault of migrants. We need politicians who will speak up bravely and also tell the truth and say migration has benefited this country, it has made us better as a society, and we will stand in solidarity with those people who need us better more than ever before. And just one last thing, the Windrush scandal was a complete stain on our history. It's not talked about enough that in the compensation scheme, people have still not received that compensation. In fact, 50 people died before they've received that compensation. So not only did they have the insult of the scandal itself, they've also received the backlash or even the second insult. You
don't have subjects, don't you?
Well, Windrush is definitely part of migration.
Well, yes, it is, but Munira.
I want to disagree with your introduction to this question when you said Liberal Democrats attack migration, or we don't speak positively about migration. Well, you said we don't speak positively about migration.
I can't remember a single Liberal Democrat politician in my living memory that's actually articulated the benefits of immigration.
Well,
I thought it was a bit unfair, but I'm not here to fight your corner.
Well, I know I have, and certainly others have. I mean, I've got up in the House of Commons when Priti Patel was Secretary of State and pointed out that she and I were both the daughters of East African Indian immigrants to this country, and our parents were given, it wasn't particularly necessarily that welcoming an environment, but ultimately they were able to build lives for themselves in this country and given opportunities when, my mother as a young woman in Zanzibar was potentially in a dangerous situation, and that's why she came to this country as a stateless person. My dad came here to study City and Guilds in electronic engineering and then built up his own business. And I love to talk about the fact that immigrants have been massive wealth creators in this country. Particularly if you look at the East African Indian community, which is where I hail from, some of the biggest wealth creators and multimillionaire business owners who've created jobs and economic growth in this country are immigrants as well. So there's the economic piece. And as Zack said, there is the whole cultural piece and the fact that we have all of these different cuisines and different cultures coming together. I'm in a mixed marriage and I have mixed race children. And, I don't even think about really really the colour of my skin. I love the fact that we're a multicultural society. I'm really proud of our society and the fact that immigrants have done so incredibly well in this country. That's not to say that there aren't problems. And I think as far as immigration policy goes, we should be led by the needs of the economy. And what Nigel Farage has come out with today, good grief, what is going to happen to our construction industry, our hospitality industry, our NHS, our care system, if he and frankly some right-wing Conservatives ever got their hands on power again. I mean, it was just because we know that the Conservatives continue to tack to the right. They're trying to. They're a mirror image of the Reform
the highest
Party.
levels of immigration ever, though. That's the paradox, isn't it?
Well, it is, but actually a lot of those are students who don't end up staying permanently. They come for a few years, they study, they maybe work for a bit. We know our universities are among the best in the world. It's one of our best British exports, and yet they insist on cracking down on that, which is going to hurt our universities, when actually what they could simply do is take student numbers out of the immigration numbers altogether. I mean, that would be a very obvious, sensible thing to do. And they're cracking down on dependence of care workers when our care industry is on the floor. I mean, I agree with the sentiment that we should be trying to get more British people to take up care jobs. It's a highly skilled job. It's why today, as part of our social care policy, the Liberal Democrats have suggested that the minimum wage for care workers be increased by £2 an hour. And there should be a proper recognition, a Royal College of Care Workers to recognise the skill and the care that's involved.
Okay. Who is it here? Can't read it. Says, if you don't include overseas students, the numbers of immigrants are absolutely fine. I've never understood why students would be included in those figures anyway. Polly?
No, I agree. It makes no sense at all. And of course, you should take students and their dependents out. That university system would collapse without them. A lot of them have gone because of the noise and hostility in this government. This government has extraordinary hostility against the things that we're best at, like universities. I think you hear a lot of people praising immigration. I don't think it's true that somehow there's a conspiracy about this. I mean, the need for, we need to do massive building. The construction industry is desperate. Big piece in the Financial Times today saying the lack of skills is absolutely critical and there just aren't enough people and we need to bring them in. Of course we do. Now, of course, people have a sense that every country needs to police its borders. It's what makes you a country. But the idea that you can altogether stop small boats coming, it's a bit like saying we will abolish crime. Don't do the impossible. You do the best you can to police things and keep to the law as best you can. But the idea that because a small proportion of our immigrants do come without visas on the small boats. The idea that represents the nature of immigration. Most of our immigrants come because we want them, we give them visas, we need them, we need more of them. We are desperately short of the people who fled because of the great mistake of Brexit. And an awful lot of really good European people went, replaced from people further afield. I'm not sure that's what the people who voted for Brexit expected, but that's what happened.
Without wanting to get into a debate on Brexit, but I mean, because we've only got about 6 minutes left, the fact is that net immigration from the EU is still a net plus.
But still nothing like it was before, so that you talk to hospitality or social care, they say they've lost a lot of people and they're not getting the same people they were getting from those countries. They're going to the Philippines, they're going elsewhere, no longer from Ireland, no longer from France and Italy in the way that they were before. And I think we do need people, and they do add to the riches of this country in every way.
Could I just add, we could stop the boats by opening safe legal routes. That would stop the
Annabel?
boats.
Why are politicians turning more hostile, in their rhetoric at least, towards immigration? Well, it's because for a long time there has been a chasm between what the political class think and what the majority of the British public think. And we know this because of the Brexit vote. 17 million people, many of them driven by concerns about immigration. We know this because people have voted for successive Conservative governments, all of which have promised to bring down the net migration figure. Theresa May, of course, promising to to bring it down to the tens of thousands. And people, I imagine, feel very disappointed and betrayed by Conservative governments for failing to deliver that. That's not to say that the British public doesn't value immigration. That's not to say that they don't understand that some immigrants are, net beneficial to this country. When I worked at a think tank called the Entrepreneurs Network a few years ago, we put out a study that found that nearly half of the founders of the fastest growing businesses in this country were foreign born. They make a very important economic contribution. That what has become clear in just the last few years is that we do have extremely high numbers. People are worried about how sustainable that is, the impact that it's going to have on public services, on infrastructure. We have a housing crisis in this country at the moment. I think people are worried that we are importing foreign workers when we have 9.25 million economically inactive people of working age in Britain today. Why can't we fill some of those jobs?
Because a lot of them are sick
UK
and on the NHS
workers.
waiting list, which
Well,
is
of course,
7
no, I
million
agree. I think that's all.
And if you use the NHS, the person serving you is more likely to be an immigrant than the person in front of you of the queue.
So NHS aside, and I agree with you, I think we've got to fix the healthcare system. We've talked about that in order that we can get people back to work. But I think the other important point is that people are concerned about integration. Look at some of the behaviour that we have seen on the streets of Britain since October 7th at those pro-Palestinian marches. I think it's understandable.
Enormously
I'm just going to finish my point.
But there is a massacre going on in Palestine.
Zack, no one has interrupted you at all in this programme. But you constantly interrupt others, so can you just behave?
As I say, people are concerned about integration. They're concerned that when you have net migration well into the 600,000s, that doesn't give us every year, that doesn't give us enough time to properly help people assimilate into British life and British culture. They're worried that we are importing people who don't subscribe to Western liberal values as we all do. And I think many people in Britain are worried that they can't even stick their heads above the parapet and say these things for fear that they'll be accused of being racist, for fear that they'll be accused of being bigots. It simply isn't racist.
Bigotry and it's racism.
There are concerns that people are not integrating into British culture and British life as well as they could be, even though, of course, immigration has enriched us. Of course, it has in many ways improved our society.
You just don't like them walking on the street if they've got black or brown skin.
Oh, for goodness sake, that is beneath
If you're saying that you're walking in a march,
honestly,
those marches have been peaceful. Do you accept those marches have been peaceful?
Well, no, because people have been arrested at those marches, so they clearly haven't been
The people
peaceful.
being arrested have been people who have gone to incite violence and hate.
That simply isn't true. There are also people who are pro-Palestinian marchers. We had a Jewish person trying to cross the street who was told by a police officer that he couldn't because it might not be safe for him to do so.
But evidence showed he'd repeatedly tried to stir up trouble and the police had asked him to move away and he kept coming back. That would strongly indicate
that the police are concerned that there is a threat to people's safety from a minority, of course, a small minority of people who are protesting on the streets of London. And the majority, of course, are doing so peacefully. I don't think anybody's denying that.
More people will be arrested at Glastonbury.
Doesn't mean that people up and down Britain aren't watching the scenes and feeling worried that multiculturalism has failed in this country in some way.
People are worried, but that doesn't mean that those marches aren't peaceful.
But it also doesn't mean that you should accuse a fellow member of this panel of being racist, which is what you just did.
I think when something's racist,
do you want
it's
to
important
withdraw
to call
it?
out.
Do you want
No,
to
I think
withdraw
if someone says something racist, then it should be called out. Now, I realise that's difficult and it feels uncomfortable to say that. I don't know you. But I think when people step over a line, it's important we call that out.
I think when you listen back to this, you'll think that you've stepped over a line, and I think you have. Let's finish on a question from Michael, who says, a French poll found that the majority of visiting tourists prefer Italian and Spanish food to French. Sacre bleu. British food, obviously, isn't much better. So says the questioner, not me. After a late night of campaigning and writing, what is your cuisine of choice and why? Polly.
I would always go for Mediterranean that do little dishes, tapases, mezzes, things like that. The trouble with French food, it tends to be one great big plate of food, a large bit of steak and things. I think the fashion more is for people to have little bits of different dishes.
Munira.
Well, after late night campaigning, when one doesn't have time to prepare such a lovely feast, I think I'd probably go for a chapati with fried egg in it. So whereas my Geordie husband would go for Warburtons with his fried egg in it, I'll embrace my Asian heritage and have a chapati with fried egg and roll it up and eat it. And that is a nice quick filler after you've been out late night campaigning and stuffing envelopes or meeting with your campaign team.
Zach?
You can make me seem uncouth, but I'm going for pizza.
Any particular?
Vegan margarita.
Oh, it had to be, didn't it? It had to be vegan. Annabel?
I think I might do beans on toast, which isn't wholly patriotic, but somehow feels like a British dish. Although I think British cuisine gets a bad rep. It's obviously improved enormously in recent years.
M&S chicken fajitas.
Oh, nice.
Love a fajita. Right, thank you very much indeed to all four of you, Zack Polanski, Munira Wilson, Polly Toynbee and Annabel Denham. Coming up in the next hour, we are going to return to the subject, Polly won't like this, but we're going to return to the subject of milkshaking politicians. Because many people sort of rather laugh at it, many people sneer at it, but it is actually a form of assault. And yet people seem to think it's entirely acceptable to throw milkshakes at politicians. This isn't the first time that it's happened to Nigel Farage. It isn't the first time it's happened to other politicians too. Can there ever be a justification for doing this sort of thing? Because if you're a politician on the other end of it, you don't know what's being thrown at you. Now, you might momentarily be very frightened. You might think, well, it all comes as part of the political territory. It shouldn't though, should it?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, a woman's been arrested after Nigel Farage had milkshake thrown over him in Essex. It's his first full day of campaigning for Reform UK since announcing he's taking over as party leader and standing as an MP. Well, LBC's Lucinda Horsley has more on this.
Nigel Farage had been speaking to reporters in a pub after his rally in Clacton. Just as he left around 2 o'clock this afternoon, a drink was thrown on him as he boarded his campaign bus. Essex police say a 25-year-old woman from Clacton has been arrested on suspicion of assault. A second man's also being questioned on suspicion of assaulting an emergency worker while officers were responding to what happened.
Major NHS hospitals in London have been hit by a cyber attack. A critical incident has been declared with operations cancelled and patients being diverted to other sites. The hospitals affected include Guy's and St Thomas's and King's College and Royal Brompton. Toby Lewis is Global Head of Threat Analysis at cybersecurity company Darktrace. He told LBC News why hackers target healthcare services.
I mean, ultimately, you've got a group of financially motivated individuals, guys that want money, who are looking to target organisations that are more likely to pay than not. And healthcare, because of its critical services that it provides, is a real target.
A 19-year-old man's been jailed for 28 years for the murder of two men outside a Halifax nightclub. Rashane Douglas from Huddersfield stabbed 21-year-old Joshua Clark and Haydar Shah, who was 19, on October the 1st last year. A report by the Metropolitan Police Commissioner says by March next year, his force will have its lowest staffing levels for a decade. Sir Mark Rowley says a shortfall's partly due to inadequate funds and low recruitment. Former Met police officer Graham Wetone told LBC keeping hold of staff is also an issue.
The population is increasing, yet the number of officers is decreasing, which places a higher demand on those people that are willing to join the police and actually protect society.
And Normandy veterans have been travelling to France to share their memories of the D-Day landings ahead of the 80th anniversary. They've laid a wreath in the sea in honour of those who didn't make it to shore. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 30 points at 82.32. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.17. LBC weather drying up in the south this evening, staying windy and wet in the north, and temperatures down to 5 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
And a very good evening too if you've just tuned in. It's 9:04 on LBC. Now, Nigel Farage has had a milkshake thrown over him after launching his election campaign in Clacton-on-Sea in Essex. Lovely town, Clacton. I used to go there as a child on day trips to the beach. I remember going on, I think it was Clacton Pier. I went on a roller coaster at the age of 10 with my dad and spent the whole ride crying my eyes out. I was absolutely petrified. Anyway, that's nothing to do with this story. Now, the new leader of Reform UK was leaving the Wetherspoons Moon and Starfish pub in Clacton, where he's standing to be an MP, when a young woman in a grey hooded jumper threw a drink in his face before throwing the cup at him and then walking off. And it appeared to be a McDonald's milkshake. Now, he was seen wincing as the liquid hit his face, then wiping it away as he was ushered out of the way by his team. Essex police said they've arrested a 25-year-old woman from Clacton after responding to a report of a drink being thrown at a man in Marine Parade East at around 2:10 p.m. this afternoon. As officers were arresting the woman, a second person, a man, was arrested on suspicion of assaulting an emergency worker. Both individuals remain in police custody for questioning. Now, nearly 2 hours after the incident, Nigel Farage appeared in front of the Reform UK bus with a McDonald's banana milkshake. I can't think of anything more disgusting. In fact, I don't like any milkshakes. And said, "My milkshake brings all the people to the rally." That's on his Twitter feed. Should you wish to watch it. In fact, I think have we got a little recording of it?
My milkshake brings all the people to the rally.
Apparently he was quoting a song by Kelis, is it? Kelis. It's such a popular music beat combo, Your Honour. But speaking to ITV about the incident,